Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn's Thrive in China Roundtable. Before we start our roundtables, just a little bit of administration before we begin. If you are a newbie, a startup, or an experienced China hand, I would love to know what your background is. This allows me to get to know my audience, whether you are watching this live or whether you are watching this on replay. The community is growing week on week, which is amazing, but it's always nice for me to know a little bit more about who each of you are. So do let me know, are you newbies? Are you startups? Are you experienced China hands? You can put that in the chat box or even just send me an email to give me a bit of background about what your pain points in China might be. A little bit about myself. My name is Christina Kohler-Colucci. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. I have 18 years of on-the-ground experience in China, specifically in corporate services and compliance. My brother, who is our managing partner, is based in Hong Kong, and he has over 25 years in corporate services and compliance in Hong Kong. We help foreign investors with their market entry into China and Hong Kong, assisting them with all corporate services and administration needs. Going through everything from pre-investment advisory to implementation to growth and scale. Over the last 18 years, I've created certain administrative processes to ease the pain of foreign investors in terms of what type of foundation they need to create for China. If you're interested in looking at these administrative processes, you can go to our website under resources. There's the China Roadmap series, and you can download these administrative processes to give you a bit of insight. And last but not least, before we start today's session, as a thank you for all of you that are showing either live or watching on replay, I do offer a free copy of our ebook, which is the 10 biggest mistakes companies make. If you've already received a copy, fantastic. If not, then email me at christina@woodburnglobal.com and I'd be happy to give you a complimentary copy. So let's get cracking on today's roundtable, which I have received a lot of interest on. So I do want to get started. I've just given myself a time limit in terms of how far we can get along. So my timer will ring in 45 minutes so that we have room for Q&A. If you do have any questions in regards to today's content, please insert them in the chat box and we will get to then the Q&A at the end. So the topic for today is how to legally hire and collaborate with employees in China without opening your own local entity. It is a commitment to set up an entity in China. It requires financial resources, it requires manpower, it requires creating a budget. And sometimes you just need somebody on the ground to help you fulfill certain functions without actually having an entity to transact with. You just need the people. So how can you do that without having an actual local entity? So what I want to cover today a little bit is a background on Chinese employment law. I'm not going to bore you. I've got 5 or 6 questions that I'm going to go through so that you have an understanding of what it means to employ people in China. Okay. And then I'm going to give you the solutions on what you can do to actually hire people without having your own entity. So we're going to hit the Chinese employment law. Now, the first question that gets raised is, can you hire in China without a legal presence? Ultimately, no. Okay. Companies, if you want to hire a mainland Chinese person or an expatriate that is residing in China, you need to have a local legal corporate presence within the mainland Chinese jurisdiction to hire and employ these potential candidates. Okay. What does a legal corporate presence mean? It means that you need to have an entity that has been registered, either a subsidiary, a branch, or a representative office that actually is the legal employer of these candidates. All right. So ultimately, you need to have an entity that does this. I will be touching on freelance agreements and doing direct employment and what are the liabilities on that later on in the presentation. Is a written employment contract required? Yes, a written employment contract is required in China. There's a lot of blurb that is on this page, but what I want you to remember in your mind is that if you don't have a written employment contract, the employee has the right to go to the Labor Arbitration Committee, i.e. the Labor Bureau, and file a complaint and ask for compensation, which is double pay, double monthly pay, until a written contract is actually signed. So when you see severe penalties, that is the severe penalty. We just recently had a case where we had a company use an employer of record service, and ultimately the employee never signed off on the employment contract. For 7 months, there was no employment contract physically signed. They decided to terminate the relationship because the employee was not going up to par, and the employer of record had a liability to pay back 7 months worth of salary, because double pay is required for each month that the contract is not signed. It did go to the Labor Arbitration Committee. There were actual face-to-face meetings to justify the case, explain the relationship, and also explain why there was a termination. But ultimately, the law is you have to pay double pay if there's no written employment contract, and there was none. Okay, the company had signed off on it, but the employee had never done that. And I just want to highlight, in this particular situation, it seemed like the employee did that on purpose because they felt that the relationship would not go on. And unfortunately, there was nobody following up. People had forgotten, and as a consequence, there was this penalty. So is a written employment contract required? Yes, it is. Is a fixed term employment contract permissible? Yes. Fixed term contracts are absolutely permissible. They can be 1 year long, 2 years long, 10 years long, as you wish. The rule of thumb, however, is that you can only sign 2 fixed term contracts. On the 3rd contract, it has to be open-ended. So an indefinite term of agreement. Why would you sign a fixed term employment? My assumption would be that you're not sure about the candidate. You're also not sure about your China strategy, and therefore you want this fixed term employment contract to protect yourself and have ease of termination. However, if you're going into the Chinese market and you're pretty much committed, then my recommendation would just be to sign an open-ended agreement, because in the end of the day, the termination clauses are exactly the same, whether it's fixed term or whether it's open-ended. Are there other hiring alternatives besides direct employment? Yes, and very quickly, I'm just going to run through these 3 options because there are still companies out there who use these 3 options. One is utilizing a labor dispatch agency who hires temporary, auxiliary, or subsidiary roles, meaning these are not permanent roles and are not considered to be permanent roles. Ultimately, what this relationship is, it's a bit like the employer of record that I'm going to explain later, is that the labor dispatch agency will hire these temporary employees for the period of term that is actually required. You can also have part-time employment. Part-time employees work less than 4 hours per day, less than 24 hours per week. There is no social insurance housing fund that is paid. And they have minimum rights because it is a part-time employment, all right? Independent contractors. So you might have people in China who are working independently for you, for example, sales reps, and you just want to contract them. It's not a full-time job. It's just you give them a commission if there is a sale that has occurred. Now, in this scenario, if you do have this independent contractor relationship, we would recommend that the independent contractor set up their own company in China so that it is a commercial relationship between a company and a company versus a company and an individual, all right? That will just save you in case there are any breach of contracts, breach of the commercial agreements. If you don't formulate the relationship like that, you will be more at risk in case you do want to terminate. And there could be more liabilities and repercussions that fall upon you, depending on whether that independent contractor has lost face, whether they've declared their own income on what they've earned, etc. So it can get a bit complicated. Now, the biggest question that I get asked is freelancing legal in China? Now, in the Chinese labor law, there is no article or clause that talks about freelancing. So there's no regulation that governs a freelancing relationship, okay? Are there relationships that exist that are freelancing? Yes, there are. I know a lot. And I've also seen a lot that have gone wrong. So what can happen? Now you have a relation, I'm going to use the UK as an example. So you've got your own UK company. You've decided to freelance with an individual that's in mainland China. You've written emails, you've got kind of terms and conditions. Maybe you haven't even signed a freelancing agreement. It's just all kind of been written in emails. And you say, okay, these are the payment terms if you're successful, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the issue is that the freelancer in China is responsible on the income that he or she earns to declare income on that income tax on that salary, as well as social insurance, as well as housing fund. That needs to be paid on the income that they are earning, all right? And it is also the responsibility of the individual freelancer to pay it, declare it, okay? Of course, it would be better in this scenario to make sure there's a formal agreement regarding this freelancing arrangement to highlight that the freelancer is liable to pay for income tax, social insurance, and housing fund, and that it is not the liability of the UK company to handle any of that. That just protects them, okay? However, if you call this arrangement a freelancing arrangement, the agreement might not actually be binding in China. It might help you in the UK, but what does that get you ultimately? So I want you to be aware that we've had situations where freelancers have pocketed everything they've earned, not declared it at all, hence not paid income tax, social insurance, and housing fund. They were also, on the side of the freelancer, they were also under the belief that if they did a good job and hit certain KPIs, that the company would then set up an entity and they would become a full-time employee. In this one case study, this did not happen. And as a result, the freelancer actually did go to the Labor Arbitration Committee and filed a suit against the UK company. Now, what this can do if you don't take this seriously is that the UK company's name can actually be put on a blacklist in that city, not just with the Labor Bureau, but also with the Ministry of Commerce, preventing you from doing further strategy and planning in the Chinese market. So it can turn bad if you don't take this seriously. So the main solution that we have is to utilize what we call as an employer of record service. This ultimately means that you are using a Chinese entity in China, a China registered company, to hire the candidates that you would like to employ in China. This Chinese entity is then officially the employer of record. On paper, they've got employment contracts, employee handbooks, company policies that the employees have to abide by. They handle the full payroll arrangement, everything from salary breakdowns to salary declarations, housing fund, social insurance declarations, even reimbursement of expenses. Okay, they are officially the employers of record. All right. If anybody's got any questions on that, put that in the chat box, but I do have a diagram that we will refer to as well. Now, why would you use this employer of record service? Now, I do want people to understand that the employer of record service should not be something that is a long-term strategy, okay? It is something that you will utilize to get the ball rolling in terms of your China strategy. It is an intermediary solution for you until certain KPIs are hit that then trigger you to say, either we're going to exit the market and stop this relationship, or we're going to move forward and actually set up our own entity. Okay. I want people to have this concept in mind because there are a lot of people who get lazy, get comfortable with this arrangement, and ultimately It can cause you to lose candidates. It can also cause you to lose existing employees because they're not comfortable with the arrangement. All right. But let me get into a little bit of details in terms of why would you use this service? So I've put in here 4 scenarios. One is companies requiring to onboard local staff to handle ground operations, but ultimately the company strategy doesn't require a company setup. I should have put yet, doesn't require a company setup yet. The second is you need to test the Chinese market and hire local staff for early market research, marketing activities, exploration, which can last anywhere between 1 or 2 years, but that's an interim phase. Alternatively, you've got companies with an overseas-based contractor that they wish to base in China for an interim period of time, whether that's 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. Or you've got companies that actually do have the intention of setting up an entity, but as we all know, it does take around 3 to 6 months to set up an entity in China. They have jumped the gun, found somebody they want to hire, and they need to find a solution in terms of how to hire this person as that company is being registered. Okay, so it's for an interim period as the company is actually being established. So these are usually the 4 scenarios that we see where companies need this interim solution and where it makes sense then to use an employer of record. Now, the disadvantages of this service, and again, there are disadvantages, and I want people to not take this lightly. Again, I've put 4 reasons. 1, the employee's sense of belonging will not be the best because the client has no legal entity in China. So the employee will always have a sense of instability in their mind. If I don't perform, I'm out of a job. And when you go in the recruitment phase of hiring people, it's not the best selling point to say, actually, we don't have an entity, but we've got an intermediary company that will hire you. You know, it's not, you're not going to convince people in terms of your strategy. It might not be easy to hire employees because there are employees who are not willing to join a company under this type of employment method. The employment contract will follow the employer of record service provider. So in many instances, the client, the company itself in the UK, for example, they can't tailor make it to the terms and conditions that they want. They have to abide by this intermediary, this employer of record company's policies. And I'm going to touch on case studies on this later on. And then obviously, based on the Chinese law, the minimum term of signing an employment contract has to be 1 year. So in some instances, you might say, well, I only need somebody for 3 to 6 months. Regardless of the situation, any company in China has to sign a minimum term of 1 year. Whether you terminate earlier or not, you just have to follow the HR labor regulations of China and abide by that. Okay. So what I want people to take away from this slide in terms of disadvantages of this service is ultimately setting up type of goals and objectives and trigger points that these employees have to hit, that where you will say, okay, when we hit these trigger points, our China strategy can pivot, meaning we might then need an entity on the ground. Now, what partners can you use? Can you use to help with this employer of record relationship? Now, ultimately, you just need a company registered in China. So I have had clients use suppliers who have hired people like QC managers that are hired by factories, and they sit in the factories or they're traveling anyway to visit other suppliers. I have had clients use distributors who sit in the office of the distributor and they're an employee of the distributor. I've seen clients use TP e-commerce providers, logistics companies, media agencies, labor dispatch agencies. The labor dispatch agencies, employer of record service providers, corporate service providers, these are formally companies that offer this type of service, okay? The other ones are obviously your business relationships, and you're relying on these business partnerships to hire these people, okay? And again, I will go through case studies at the point of case studies to highlight some of the stories that I have about the pros and cons with all of this. All right. So you can use anybody. And again, I just want to highlight, there is no company in China that has a specific license for employer of record service. There are companies in China that have specific licenses for labor dispatch as labor dispatch agencies. But there is no labor law in regards to the employer of record service. Okay, so I just want to highlight that it's sort of a service that is not defined by any regulation in China, kind of a gray area whether companies can actually offer it, which is why I say ultimately any company registered in China can do it. Okay. Okay. So one thing that I want you to take into consideration when choosing the service provider of your choice, whether it's suppliers, distributors, labor dispatch agencies, corporate service providers, etc., is the following. And this is where everything gets a little bit tricky. A mainland Chinese employee has the right to receive social insurance and housing fund in the city where they are residing and where they have their hukou status. Hukou status means where their family book is registered. There are a lot of people, individuals who are trying to move their hukou status to tier 1 cities and are doing these types of applications. So you might find an employee who is actually from Nanjing, hukou status is Nanjing, but residing in Shanghai, okay? Or you might have a Shanghai resident who has a Shanghai hukou and everything is peachy keen, okay? So you have to understand what the hukou status of the mainland Chinese person is and where they are residing. Now, the issue is, since pretty much 2019, 2020, the Labor Bureau has been coming down harder and harder for companies in China that actually have employees that are not residing in the city of where that company is registered. Meaning that they are saying now, you cannot use labor dispatch agencies or local HR agencies in other cities to handle the local social insurance and housing fund. Let me explain this in greater detail. I'll use Woodburn as an example. Woodburn is a Shanghai registered entity. If we hire people in Shanghai, absolutely no problems. Those Shanghai employees are employed by a Shanghai entity. Their social insurance and housing fund is registered with the Shanghai Housing Fund Bureau and the Shanghai Social Insurance Bureau. Okay. If Woodburn decides, well, actually for growth and scale, we need to expand our business and hire somebody up in Beijing, we're going to run into difficulties because that Beijing employee may have a request that they want their social insurance and housing fund to be paid in Beijing. The only way that Woodburn can do this is if Woodburn sets up a branch office in Beijing. And, you know, that comes down to pivoting your China strategy and seeing whether it makes sense to set up a branch office there. Alternatively, in the past, you used to be able to use HR agencies in Beijing to handle that social insurance and housing fund. And now these third-party local agencies are not offering this service anymore because they are being bombarded by the labor bureaus that they cannot offer it. Okay. The third solution, the fact that I don't want to open up a branch office, that there's no third-party local agency, the only other solution is to say to that employee in Beijing, listen, you're going to be hired by the Shanghai entity, and you're going to get your social insurance and housing fund then paid and declared in Shanghai. It's up to then that Beijing candidate to say, I agree or I don't agree. So when you are choosing these service providers to act as these intermediaries as these employers of record to hire people, make sure they are based in the right cities, that you're not running into difficulties with your candidates in regards to this social insurance and housing fund component. Okay. Now, not all cities in China are abiding by the third-party local agencies, meaning that there are some cities still today where you have this loophole of using third-party local agencies, but I do foresee this ending year on year, where more and more third-party local agencies and cities are saying, we can't do this anymore. So if you choose that option, it is not a long-term solution, but in any case, employer of record should not be a long-term solution anyhow. Okay. If you've got any questions on this point, because I know that might have been a lot to digest, please do put your questions in the chat box as well. So I thought to ease an understanding of what the employer of record relationship looks like, I highlighted it here where you've got the employer of record in red, that's the intermediary. You've got the client, which is the overseas company that is looking to hire a candidate. And then you've got in green the employee. Ultimately, how you need to perceive this relationship is that between the client and the employee, it is an operating employer, meaning that the client is giving directives on a day-to-day basis as to how this relationship should be formulated, okay? Or what day-to-day functions and transactions should be happening with that employee. And that employee is actually reporting on his or her daily operations to the client, okay? Then between the employer of record and the client, there is a service agreement where it basically states that the client is utilizing the employer of record for employer of record services, right? And then between the employer of record and the employee, that's the administration employer, where on paper, they are officially the employer of record, meaning that they have signed directly with the employee a written contract, hopefully also an employee handbook, and any other company policies that have to be abided with. The employee, from an administrative standpoint, is reporting to the employer of record in terms of expenses and any questions they might have in regards to payroll. So it is a three-party co-employment relationship. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the employer of record just simply has to be a Chinese registered entity. Because again, let me reiterate, there is no law in regards to this service, okay? So it's a loophole that service providers have found, but ultimately also anybody can do it. Suppliers can hire these people, distributors can hire these people, etc. All right? It's just that the employer of record has full liability over this employment relationship. Okay. So let me now go on to case studies. And let me go back in the slides a little bit to the advantages and the disadvantages. And I'll predominantly highlight the disadvantages. So the first thing I'm going to look at is a case study from a Spanish company that decided to hire an individual in Shanghai. The actual purpose for this employment was Chinese market exploration, reaching out to distributors, reaching out to end clients. They were a Spanish company selling high-end machinery and high-tech machinery and equipment. And they gave this employee 2 years to actually research the market. In those 2 years, deals were transacted between Spain and the customers, all going very well, but the outcome was that the revenue that was generated was less than expected. And as a result, they decided to terminate that relationship, and they gave a very valid reason. They said, actually, what this individual has done has set a foundation for us. We've got customer contacts now. We can do this directly from Spain. Doesn't make sense for us to have an entity. Doesn't make sense for us to have an employee. Okay. Now, in terms of disadvantages, we have seen a German company also use the employer of record service to hire an individual. The recruitment went very well. The onboarding went very well, but very swiftly after that onboarding, the employee started asking every week to the German company, when are you establishing an entity in China? You told me that in the interview process, it was going to be as soon as I hired. We are now at the end of December. The next time it was end of January. And as of now, we are in March. And the company still has not taken action on this. The employee is feeling unstable. They just don't know what to think. Now, what has helped in this scenario has been the fact that the borders have been opened, is that this employee in China did do a business trip back to Germany. They got to meet the entire team. And when he came back, he really did have a better sense of the strategy and a better sense of the direction in which the company was going into. They are now looking to recruit another additional 2 people, which will actually be the trigger point at that point to set up an entity, because they'll have 3 people on staff, and they want to provide this sense of belonging and this sense of stability to future candidates on the ground. But they needed this individual to really get the ball rolling. And the fact that he kept pushing actually then pushed them to relook at the growth strategy, discuss with management, and start making decisions on the progress. Okay. So these are 2 case studies that I want to highlight. The third case study is regarding the written contract that I had highlighted earlier. We also had a client who, prior to establishing their business in China, ran into the difficulty of having never signed a written employment contract, wanted to terminate a staff, and that got them into paying an additional 7 months of gross salary to the individual as compensation. What a waste of a budget, right? So even though you can create these scenarios where you don't have a legal entity in China, you still have a budget in relation to this business transaction of having an employer of record. Make sure you're doing things correctly. The fourth case study that I want to highlight is using suppliers, using distributors, using TPs, using people who are not actual service providers in terms of providing these services. We had an Austrian company who utilized their supplier to not just hire 1 person, but 5 people, which should have been a trigger to them to say, we actually need an entity in China. The supplier hired 5 people. Basically, the supplier invoiced Germany every month for the payroll breakdown, giving Germany the payroll breakdown, gross salary, social insurance, housing fund, etc. On a business trip to China, one of the procurement managers noticed in the office that one of his staff had broken his leg and was going from workstation to workstation with an envelope, and he noticed that people were putting money in the envelope. So he started asking his team, what is going on? Why is he asking for money? And lo and behold, it was revealed that the supplier was never contributing to the social insurance and housing fund for these 5 employees. In fact, he was pocketing that money that he was receiving from Germany, which meant that these employees had no medical insurance, no pension fund, no accidental insurance, which is exactly what happened to this staff. He had had an accident and his medical bills were not being covered. So he was going from workstation to workstation, asking people to contribute to his bills. Okay, real life case study. Probably for some of you, it sounds like a movie. It's not. It's real life case study. So I want people to understand with these case studies, and obviously these are the worst case scenarios, right? But it is your job, if you are going to take this route where you don't need an entity in China, but you want to use an intermediary, an employer of record, to hire candidates in China, that's all well and good. But the goal is obviously to treat these employees fairly, equitably. I am sure that you as employees or you as business owners also want your insurances to be paid, and also don't want to get in trouble with the labor law and the labor bureaus, right? So make sure you have full transparency and clarity over how the relationship works, and proof that income tax is being paid, social insurance is being paid, housing fund is being paid, and use your candidate and communicate with your candidates and employees, right? Ultimately, they're yours. You have an operating relationship with them, meaning my assumption is you're talking to them almost on a daily basis about what they're doing in China, what are the outcomes, what sales have they achieved, or what suppliers have they met with, what brand marketing they've done, whoever the employee is and what their function is. You are probably talking with them on a daily basis. So why not in that conversation also say, are you happy with the employer of record? Are they treating you okay? Is your payroll being done properly? Nothing is going to hurt your situation if you don't have that open communication. Okay, so make sure you are checking in on them, and that from an employment relationship, they feel secure, and you also feel secure that everything is compliance. And I tell you all this because for every single, I see it after the employer of record service is completed, because we do the incorporations for our clients, is that when there is then the transfer from the employer of record to their own entity, we can see where there are certain miscommunications, but miscommunications in terms of social insurance breakdowns, housing fund breakdowns, etc. Now, another case study that I want to highlight before we conclude for today is ultimately the employer of record will have their own internal policies about social insurance and housing fund. So to give you an example, we have seen employees of employer of records who, because of the size of the employer of record, was also receiving complementary social insurance and housing fund, meaning they were injecting more, the company was injecting more into these funds. Now, when you're starting up in China, you might not want to have that policy. You might not want to, your budget might just be allocating for mandatory social insurance and housing fund and not for the complementary social insurance and housing fund, because that's just an addition to your budget. You also have to be aware that certain companies in China will have their own policies about what are the rates they use, for example, for housing fund. In Shanghai, you can choose 5%, 7%, or 12% to calculate the housing fund rate, okay? Most companies will choose 5. There might be some out there who choose 12. So it is really, really important that you understand these discrepancies that can happen, particularly in the transferring phase, because suddenly the employee might say, well, now that I'm hired by you, I was paying 12% into my housing fund and now it's only 5%. I don't appreciate that. Right? So there are these nuances that you have to be aware of when switching from the employer of record to your actual own entity. Okay. The conclusion that I want to raise for today is take care of your employees fairly. All right. They are your employees, and hopefully they are your long-term employees. So treat them well and gain knowledge yourself about what it takes to hire somebody in China, even if it's not you that's hiring them, right? Make sure you've gotten that clarity, that transparency, and you understand these types of nuances that, that exist, okay? So that is the end of today's presentation. I did see questions that have come in, so I will be raising those as well. For those of you that have questions, please insert them into the chat box. And for those of you that have showed up live, I would love to hear what your biggest takeaway was from today. Helps me with the presentations. So Tim was asking, can this solution support foreigners and obtain work permits, visas for foreigners? Ultimately, yes, it can, Tim. So the employer of record can absolutely hire foreigners. They can apply for the work permits and the residence visas. Now, with the borders being open, I feel more secure to say that it will be easier for companies in China to obtain the work permits and residence visas, but it is never a guarantee. Never. The company in China has to go through an application procedure to apply for the work permits and the residence visas. In that application, the company has to show reasons as to why they need a foreigner to be on staff. Okay. And again, it is never a guarantee whether the Labor Bureau will approve it or not. So with foreigners, yes, it is a solution, but again, there is no guarantee as to whether the work permits and residence visas will be issued. Your next question, Tim, was, does the company providing the service need a dispatching license? So dispatching agencies are usually, their core service is to dispatch employees for a limited period of time. It's not a permanent employment, okay? Is it better if they have a dispatch license? Yes, but it's not a mandatory function because, again, the employment should be temporary, not permanent. ultimately anybody can do that employment. Okay. And it just is a matter of, let me go back to the diagram for you. Oops, sorry. Let me go back to this diagram for you. The service agreement between the employer of record and client can state whatever service. It can say consulting, advisory. What we all know internally is that the invoice that is going to be issued according to that service agreement is going to match the salary and expenses of that individual, right? So, you know, nobody will relate that service agreement necessarily to hiring somebody on the ground. As long as you have a Chinese entity hiring somebody, nobody knows whether that person is actually hired by somebody else. You have distributors or suppliers in China that have reps that are continuously communicating with overseas offices. Whether now somebody knows whether that person is actually your employee or not, it's very hard to discover. And that's why I say employer of record service is not actually in any type of law. So it is a flexible way of how you're going to actually arrange that service agreement. Okay. I hope I answered those questions, Tim. I hope I was able to answer those for you. Let me know if I haven't or you need a bit more clarity on that. Again, like I said, love to hear what your biggest takeaways from today were. If you want to have more advice specifically on the employer of record service, we're more than welcome to help you. We can set up a 15-minute discovery call to see if we can be of any assistance. The link is actually there. Otherwise, just email me at christina@woodburnglobal.com and I'd be happy to set up a chat with you. If you enjoyed, I mean, you're all subscribed to our Thrive in China Roundtable, but if you feel like any colleagues should be part of our roundtable, they can sign up through our website at woodburnglobal.com/events. Next week's roundtable is going to be talking about the advantages of having a non-executive director in China. Non-executive directors are members of companies' boards, but they're not part of the actual executive and execution team. They don't deal with day-to-day management, but they are there to act as mentors and coaches and guides in relation to doing business in China. So the question is, ultimately, do you see you need this, and would that be of value? A lot of people don't even know this type of service and these type of individuals exist in China. So if you want to join, again, same time next week, 1 p.m. Central European time. Link is exactly the same to join as well. Thank you, everybody, for participating and for coming in. This was a very short presentation. I hope I was able to help you. Again, if you need any additional assistance, don't hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Take care and goodbye.